Chapter 29 of The Beetle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. The Beetle by Richard Marsh. Chapter 29. The House on the Road from the Workhouse. Mr. Holt looked as if he was in somebody else's garments. He was so thin and worn and wasted that the suit of clothes which one of the men had lent him hung upon him as on a scarecrow. I was almost ashamed of myself for having incurred a share of the responsibility of taking him out of bed. He seemed so weak and bloodless that I should not have been surprised if he had fainted on the road. I had taken care that he should eat as much as he could eat before we started. The suggestion of starvation which he had conveyed to one's mind was dreadful. And I had brought a flask of brandy in case of accidents. But in spite of everything, I could not conceal from myself that he would be more at home in a sick bed than in a jolting cab. It was not a cheerful drive. There was in Sydney's manner towards me an air of protection which I instinctively resented. He appeared to be regarding me as a careful and anxious nurse might regard a wrong-headed and disobedient child. Conversation distinctly languished. Since Sydney seemed disposed to patronise me, I was bent on snubbing him. The result was that the majority of the remarks which were uttered were addressed to Mr. Holt. The cab stopped, after what had appeared to me to be an interminable journey. I was rejoiced at the prospect of its being at an end. Sydney put his head out of the window. A short parley with the driver ensued.
"This is Hammersmith Workhouse. It's a large place, sir. Which part of it might you be wanting?"
Sydney appealed to Mr. Holt. He put his head out of the window in his turn. He did not seem to recognise our surroundings at all.
"We have come a different way. This is not the way I went. I went through Hammersmith, and to the casual ward. I don't see that here."
Sydney spoke to the cabman.
"Driver, where's the casual ward?" "That's the other end, sir."
"Then take us there." He took us there. Then Sydney appealed again to Mr. Holt.
"Shall I dismiss the cabman, or don't you feel equal to walking?"
"Thank you, I feel quite equal to walking. I think the exercise will do me good."
So the cabman was dismissed, a step which we, and I in particular, had subsequent cause to regret. Mr. Holt took his bearings. He pointed to a door which was just in front of us.
"That's the entrance to the casual ward, and that, over it, is the window through which the other man threw a stone. I went to the right, back the way I had come.
We went to the right.
I reached this corner."
We had reached a corner. Mr. Holt looked about him, endeavouring to recall the way he had gone. A good many roads appeared to converge at that point, so that he might have wandered in either of several directions. Presently he arrived at something like a decision.
"I think this is the way I went. I am nearly sure it is."
He led the way, with something of an air of dubitation, and we followed. The road he had chosen seemed to lead to nothing and nowhere. We had not gone many yards from the workhouse gates before we were confronted by something like chaos. In front and on either side of us were large spaces of waste land. At some more or less remote period, attempts appeared to have been made at brick-making. There were untidy stacks of bilious-looking bricks in evidence. Here and there enormous weather-stained boards announced that this desirable land was to be let for building purposes. The road itself was unfinished. There was no pavement, and we had the bare uneven ground for sidewalk. It seemed, so far as I could judge, to lose itself in space, and to be swallowed up by the wilderness of desirable land which lay beyond. In the near distance there were houses enough and to spare, of a kind. But they were in other roads. In the one in which we actually were, on the right at the end, there was a row of unfinished carcases, but only 2 buildings which were in anything like a fit state for occupation. One stood on either side, not facing each other. There was a distance between them of perhaps 50 yards. The sight of them had a more exciting effect on Mr Holt than it had on me. He moved rapidly forward, coming to a standstill in front of the one upon our left, which was the nearer of the pair.
'This is the house!'
he exclaimed. He seemed almost exhilarated. I confess that I was depressed. A more dismal looking habitation one could hardly imagine. It was one of those dreadful jerry-built houses which, while they are still new, look old. It had quite possibly only been built a year or 2, and yet, owing to neglect, or to poverty of construction, or to a combination of the 2, it was already threatening to tumble down. It was a small place, a couple of storeys high, and would have been dear, I should think, at £30 a year. The windows had surely never been washed since the house was built. Those on the upper floor seemed all either cracked or broken. The only sign of occupancy consisted in the fact that a blind was down behind the window of the room on the ground floor. Curtains there were none. A low wall ran in front, which had apparently at one time been surmounted by something in the shape of an iron railing. A rusty piece of metal still remained on one end. But since there was only about a foot between it and the building, which was practically built upon the road, whether the wall was intended to ensure privacy, or was merely for ornament, was not clear.
'This is the house!'
repeated Mr Holt, showing more signs of life than I had hitherto seen in him. Sydney looked it up and down. It apparently appealed to his aesthetic sense as little as it did to mine.
'Are you sure?'
'I am certain.'
'It seems empty.'
'It seemed empty to me that night. That is why I got into it in search of shelter.'
'Which is the window which served you as a door?'
'This one.'
Mr Holt pointed to the window on the ground floor, the one which was screened by a blind.
'There was no sign of a blind when I first saw it, and the sash was up. It was that which caught my eye.'
Once more Sydney surveyed the place in comprehensive fashion, from roof to basement. Then he scrutinisingly regarded Mr Holt.
'You are quite sure this is the house? It might be awkward if you proved mistaken. I am going to knock at the door, and if it turns out that that mysterious acquaintance of yours does not and never has lived here, we might find an explanation difficult.'
'I am sure it is the house, certain. I know it. I feel it. Here, and here.'
Mr Holt touched his breast and his forehead. His manner was distinctly odd. He was trembling, and a fevered expression had come into his eyes. Sydney glanced at him for a moment in silence. Then he bestowed his attention upon me.
'May I ask if I may rely upon your preserving your presence of mind?'
The mere question ruffled my plumes. 'What do you mean?'
'What I say. I am going to knock at that door, and I am going to get through it somehow. It is quite within the range of possibility that when I am through there will be some strange happenings, as you have heard from Mr Holt. The house is commonplace enough without, you may not find it so commonplace within. You may find yourself in a position in which it will be in the highest degree essential that you should keep your wits about you.'
'I am not likely to let them stray.'
'Then that's all right. Do I understand that you propose to come in with me?